I found teeth marks on my cooler that were too big for any bear. February in the Boundary Waters isn't exactly prime camping season, but I needed the silence. The kind of quiet you can only get when the lakes are locked under 3 feet of ice and most sensible people are home by their fireplaces. I'd driven up from Duluth with my winter gear and enough food for 4 days at a remote site near Knife Lake. The first thing I noticed was how hungry I felt setting up camp, even though I'd eaten a full breakfast just 2 hours earlier. Real hunger, the kind that makes your stomach feel hollow and your hands shake slightly. I chalked it up to the cold air and physical work of breaking trail to my campsite. My dome tent went up easily in the clearing I'd snowshoed to, about a 1/4 mile from the nearest portage trail. The silence was immediate and complete. No wind, no distant traffic, just the occasional crack of settling ice from the lake. I set my cooler near the tent and started gathering deadfall for a fire. That's when I really started feeling it, the hunger. Not just empty stomach hunger, but something deeper, like I hadn't eaten in days instead of hours. I opened a protein bar and ate it mechanically, but it didn't help. If anything, the sensation got worse. I built my fire as the short winter day faded, the flames dancing against snow-heavy pine boughs. The warmth felt good, but that gnawing hunger stayed with me. I heated soup on my camp stove and ate it slowly, savoring each spoonful. But 20 minutes later, I felt just as empty. Around 9 p.m., I heard my own voice calling from the tree line. "God, I'm so hungry," it said, in my exact tone and cadence. The words I'd muttered while setting up camp hours earlier. I stopped stirring my second bowl of soup and listened. The fire popped softly. Ice groaned somewhere out on the lake. Then again, from a different direction. I could eat a whole deer right now. Another thing I'd said earlier, joking to myself while gathering wood. The spoon felt cold in my hand. I set down the bowl and reached for my headlamp, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing moved in the circle of light, but I caught something that made my chest tighten. Footprints in the snow, circling my campsite in a wide loop. Big prints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I kept the headlamp on and tried to eat more soup, but my appetite was completely gone now. The hunger remained though, like a separate thing living in my stomach. I cleaned my bowl with snow and sealed everything in the cooler, then dragged it closer to the fire. My FRS radio crackled to life around 10:30. Static first, then something that sounded like chewing. Wet, methodical sounds, like someone eating something that required a lot of work. I turned the volume down but kept listening. Between the chewing sounds, I could hear what might have been breathing, heavy and irregular. I clicked the transmit button. "Hello? Anyone on channel 7? The chewing stopped immediately. Then my own voice came through the speaker. "I'm so hungry I could eat anything." I'd never said those exact words. I turned off the radio and zipped it into my jacket pocket. The fire was burning low, so I fed it more wood, each piece crackling as it caught. The flames flared higher, and something large crashed through the underbrush about 50 yards away. Heavy footsteps, but moving away from camp rather than toward it. The hunger was getting worse. I opened the cooler and ate another protein bar, then some beef jerky, then a whole package of trail mix. Nothing touched it. I felt like I was pouring food into a void. I managed to sleep a few hours, waking every time the wind shifted or a branch creaked. Around dawn, I unzipped the tent fly and immediately saw what had been left for me during the night. My cooler sat exactly where I'd placed it. but the heavy plastic lid showed deep gouges, bite marks, like something had tried to chew through it. The marks were huge, easily twice the size of what a black bear might leave. And there were scratches in the snow all around it, as if something had circled the cooler for hours, testing it. But what made me start packing immediately were the marks on the trees. 6 feet up the trunk of a massive white pine, deep gouges scored the bark. Claw marks running parallel in sets of 4. Whatever had made them was either tall enough to reach that high while standing, or had climbed the tree specifically to leave the marks where I'd be sure to see them. I broke camp in record time, not bothering with breakfast despite the hunger that was now so intense it made me dizzy. As I snowshoed back toward the Portage Trail, I realized something that made me move even faster. I couldn't remember eating dinner the night before, or lunch, or that morning's breakfast, despite the clear memory of driving up from Duluth afterward. The protein bars and trail mix from during the night felt like the first food I'd had in days, but I remembered being hungry the entire time. The truck started on the first try, and I had the heat running full blast before I'd even backed out of the parking area. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw something pale moving between the trees at the forest edge, but I didn't slow down to look. I stopped for a full meal at the first diner I found in Grand Marais, eating enough food for 3 people. The waitress commented on my appetite, but I barely heard her. I was too busy trying to figure out when I'd actually last eaten and why I still felt hollow despite the pounds of food I'd just consumed. The hunger didn't fully fade until I was south of Duluth, back in country where the trees were smaller and the winter felt less absolute. The security monitors showed me walking through sectors I'd never been to. Graveyard shift at Northland Paper Mill meant 8 hours of mostly quiet machinery and the occasional equipment check. The mill ran skeleton crews after midnight, just essential systems keeping the massive boilers warm and the chemical tanks at proper levels. Most nights I'd make my rounds, check the cameras, and read a book in the security office. This particular Tuesday was different from the start. 3 of the main production lines were down for maintenance, leaving the mill quieter than I'd ever heard it. Just the low hum of ventilation systems and the distant whisper of steam through pipes. That kind of industrial quiet that makes you notice every small sound. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift started. Meatloaf sandwich, chips, apple, the works. But by 1 a.m. I was hungry again. Not snacky hungry, but genuinely empty. Like I'd been working physical labor for hours instead of sitting in a climate-controlled office watching screens. The security station had 12 monitors covering the main floor, storage areas, and employee sections. I kept glancing at them while updating the log, and around 1:30 I saw something that made me stop writing mid-sentence. Monitor 7 showed a figure walking through the paper storage warehouse, moving methodically between the tall stacks, checking corners, exactly like I did during my routine patrols. The timestamp showed current time, but I was sitting in the office, had been for the past hour. I cycled through the camera angles, looking for a better view. The figure stayed just at the edge of clear resolution, but the height and build looked exactly right. Same security uniform, same walking pace, same methodical pattern I used when checking the warehouse. My radio crackled. Jesus, I could eat a horse right now. My own voice, exact tone, coming through channel 3. The same thing I'd muttered to myself 20 minutes earlier while filling out equipment reports. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the warehouse. The walk took about 4 minutes through the main corridors, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The warehouse was dark except for emergency lighting, row after row of paper roll storage reaching up toward the ceiling catwalks. I worked my way through the aisles systematically, checking each row. No one there. No signs anyone had been there. But the hunger was getting worse, like a constant ache that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. Back in the security office, I rewound the warehouse camera footage. There it was again, a figure moving through the storage area at exactly the time I'd been checking it in person. But on the monitor, the aisles I just walked through showed empty. My stomach cramped with hunger. I opened the small refrigerator in the office and ate the sandwich I'd brought for later in the shift. Then the backup granola bars. Then the apple from tomorrow's lunch. Nothing helped. Around 3 a.m., the employee break room camera caught my attention. The lights were on, which was unusual for the middle of the night. I cycled to that monitor and watched someone moving around inside. Same height, same uniform, same general build as me. But the figure was opening all the refrigerators and cabinets, moving fast and methodical. I radioed the day shift supervisor's voicemail, just to create a record. "This is Stevens on night security. Possible intruder in employee break room, Sector 4. Investigating now." The break room was on the second floor, accessible by the main stairwell or the freight elevator. I took the stairs, moving quietly despite the echo of my boots on metal steps. The fluorescent lights in the break room were definitely on, casting harsh shadows through the frosted glass door. I used my key card and pushed the door open. The room was destroyed, not vandalized, ransacked. Every refrigerator door hung open, shelves pulled out, contents scattered across tables and floor. Lunch boxes had been torn open and emptied. The large commercial refrigerator that held catered lunches for the day shift looked like something had clawed at the door handle repeatedly, deep scratches in the metal. But what stopped me cold was the smell. Not rotten food or spilled milk, but something else. Something that reminded me of meat left too long in a warm car. Organic and wrong. The freight elevator down the hall activated with its familiar mechanical whine. I watched the floor indicator climb. Ground, second, third, fourth. Then back down. Fourth, third, second, ground. Then up again. No one had called it. The control panel showed no active requests. I called it to the second floor and rode down to check the ground level employee entrance. The doors were locked, card reader showing no recent activity, but the loading dock access showed something that made my radio shake in my hand. Scratches around the electronic lock, deep gouges in the metal frame, like something had tried to claw its way inside. The scratches were fresh, no rust in the grooves, metal still bright where it had been scored. My radio came alive again. I'm so hungry I could eat anything that moves. Definitely my voice, but I'd never said those words. The transmission came through clear and strong, like someone was broadcasting from inside the building. I went back to the security office and reviewed all the camera footage from the past hour. There I was on multiple monitors, checking different areas in what looked like a perfect routine patrol. But I remembered being in the office the entire time, except for the warehouse check and the break room investigation. The hunger was overwhelming now. I opened every drawer in the office looking for food, found a box of crackers someone had left months ago, and ate all of them. Then I remembered the vending machines in the main lobby and used my emergency key to open them, eating candy bars and bags of chips mechanically, barely tasting anything. Around 5:30 a.m., I found myself sitting on the break room floor surrounded by empty containers and packages. I had no memory of going back upstairs, no memory of eating most of what was scattered around me. My uniform was stained with food, and I felt sick but still hungry. The day shift supervisor found me there an hour later, passed out next to the destroyed refrigerators. He said I looked like I hadn't eaten in weeks, despite the evidence of a feeding frenzy all around me. I couldn't explain the camera footage that showed me in 3 different places at the same time. I couldn't explain the scratches on the loading dock, or why the freight elevator had run continuously for 2 hours with no operator. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for days afterward, a hollow ache that no amount of food could fill. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear my own voice on random radio frequencies, talking about how hungry I am in words I never remember saying. I woke up to the sound of someone eating in my kitchen, but I lived alone. The rental cabin near Traverse Bay was perfect for my winter writing retreat. Remote enough for no distractions, close enough to town for supply runs when needed. 3 weeks into February, I'd settled into a comfortable routine. Write until late, sleep in, repeat. The isolation was exactly what I'd paid for. The eating sound started around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Methodical chewing, like someone working through something tough. The kind of sounds you make when you're really hungry and concentrating on your food. I lay in bed listening, trying to place what I might have left out that could make those noises. The heating system settling maybe, or the old refrigerator cycling on. But it sounded too organic, too wet. I grabbed my phone for the flashlight and walked quietly toward the kitchen. The cabin was small enough that I could see the entire space from the bedroom doorway. Empty table, clean counters, nothing out of place. But the refrigerator door was standing wide open, interior light casting a cold glow across the linoleum floor. I definitely remembered closing it after my late dinner. Always did. The thing was old and loud when it ran with the door open. Walking closer, I noticed scratches on the wire shelves inside. Deep gouges, like something with claws had raked across them repeatedly. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the white coating. I closed the refrigerator and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The heating system made its usual sounds, but now I was analyzing each one, wondering what else I might be missing. The next morning I found footprints in the snow around the cabin. Large prints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the front. They circled the building in a wide loop, passing under every window. At the kitchen window, the prints clustered together, like something had stood there for a long time looking in. I'd been hungry lately, more than usual. Even with regular meals, I felt constantly empty. I'd attributed it to the cold air and the mental energy of writing. But standing there looking at those prints, the hunger felt different, more urgent. That afternoon, I drove into town for groceries, loading up on enough food for the rest of the week. Meat, bread, canned goods, more than I normally bought. The checkout clerk commented on my appetite, joking about feeding a lumberjack crew. The eating sounds came again that night, around the same time. This time, I got up immediately and walked to the kitchen without the flashlight. In the dark, I could make out a shape at the table. Tall, thin, moving in the careful way someone moves when they're concentrating on their food. The refrigerator was open again, that cold light creating stark shadows. I flicked on the overhead light. Nothing there. Just the open refrigerator and 3 of the 4 kitchen chairs pulled out and turned to face the table, like a dinner party had been interrupted mid-meal. I always left the chairs pushed in, always. I checked the refrigerator contents. Half the meat I'd bought that afternoon was gone. A whole package of ground beef, opened and empty. 2 steaks missing from their butcher paper. I had no memory of eating any of it. Outside, something tapped on the kitchen window. Not wind, too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. Like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. I walked over and looked out, but the porch light only reached a few feet into the darkness. The tapping stopped as soon as I approached the window. Then I heard my own voice from outside. I'm so hungry. Clear as day, in my exact tone and cadence. The same thing I'd muttered to myself while putting away groceries earlier. The tapping resumed, but from the living room window now. Then the bedroom window, moving around the house in the same pattern as those morning footprints. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights on, listening to my own voice call out random complaints about hunger from different windows. Things I'd said to myself over the past few days, played back in perfect detail. In the morning, I found more scratches, deep gouges around the exterior door frame, like something had tried to claw its way inside. The scratches went up higher than I could reach, even standing on the porch steps. I started checking the refrigerator obsessively after that, taking inventory of every item. But I kept finding things missing. Entire packages of food that I had no memory of eating. Meanwhile, the hunger got worse. I'd eat a full meal and feel empty again within an hour. The sounds continued every night around 3 a.m. Eating, chewing, the scrape of chairs moving across the floor. Always when I was lying in bed, always stopping the moment I got up to investigate. On Friday morning, I opened the refrigerator to find it completely empty. A week's worth of groceries gone. But what made me start packing immediately were the claw marks inside. Deep scratches covering every surface. Shelves, walls, even the ceiling. Like something had been trapped inside and had tried to claw its way out. I checked that refrigerator the night before. It had been full, and there had been no scratches. I loaded my car in broad daylight and drove straight back to Grand Rapids without stopping. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a tall, pale figure watching from the cabin's kitchen window, but I didn't slow down to look. The rental company called a week later to ask about the damaged refrigerator and the scratches around the door frame. I told them I'd noticed some animal damage, but hadn't seen what caused it. What I didn't tell them was that I was still hungry. Constantly, overwhelmingly hungry, no matter how much I ate. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I still heard the sound of chairs scraping across a floor. Even though I lived on the 3rd story of a building where all the furniture stayed exactly where I left it. The hunger didn't fade until spring, when the snow melted and the nights grew shorter. But I never went back to that cabin, and I never rented another place that remote during winter months. Some kinds of isolation aren't worth the risk. My trail camera caught something mimicking my morning routine, but 2 hours early. 3 days into a solo winter camping trip in Algonquin's backcountry, I'd settled into a comfortable rhythm. Up at dawn, coffee by the fire, checked the trail camera I'd set up for wildlife photos, then breakfast, and a day of snowshoeing. The isolation was perfect. I hadn't seen another human being since leaving the access road. The hunger started on day 2. Not normal camping appetite, but something deeper, like I hadn't eaten in days instead of hours. I'd brought plenty of food, high-calorie stuff designed for winter camping, but no matter how much I ate, the hollow feeling remained. I'd positioned my trail camera on a tree about 30 yards from my campsite, angled to catch any wildlife that might come through during the night. Mostly, I was hoping for wolves, or maybe a moose, something dramatic for the photography portfolio I was building. What I got instead was footage of myself. The camera's timestamp showed 4:17 a.m. when a figure emerged from my tent, moved to the fire ring, and began building up the coals exactly the way I did every morning. Same methodical process, scraping ash, adding tinder, blowing gently until flames caught. Then setting up my small camp stove and starting coffee water. The problem was, I'd done that exact routine at 6:30 a.m. I remembered every detail because it was part of my daily camping ritual. But according to the camera, someone had performed it perfectly 2 hours earlier. I rewound the footage and watched it again. The figure moved exactly like me. Same height, same build, same careful attention to keeping the fire small and controlled. But the image quality was just poor enough that I couldn't make out facial features clearly. Around noon, while I was eating lunch, I heard my own voice calling from the tree line. "Jesus, it's cold out here," came from somewhere among the pines to my left. My exact words from earlier that morning, delivered in my exact tone. I stopped chewing and listened. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional crack of branches settling under snow weight. Then, from a different direction, I could eat everything in this pack right now. Another thing I'd said to myself, joking about my increased appetite. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" Silence for about 30 seconds. Then my voice again, from yet another direction. "Hello? Someone there?" Perfect mimicry, down to the slight uncertainty in my tone. The trail camera was motion activated, so I checked it every few hours to see what it had captured. Mostly just me moving around camp, but there were gaps, timestamps that showed hours passing with no recorded activity, even though I distinctly remembered being in the camera's field of view during those times. That night, I kept the fire burning bright and stayed up late, feeding it regularly. Around midnight, I noticed footprints in the snow at the edge of the firelight, large prints moving in a wide circle around my campsite. They stayed just outside the reach of the flames, as if whatever made them was being very careful to avoid the light. My FRS radio crackled to life around 1 a.m. Static first, then sounds that made my skin crawl. Wet chewing, like someone eating something that required a lot of work. Gristle maybe, or something with small bones. I turned the volume down but kept listening, morbidly fascinated. Between the eating sounds, I heard breathing, heavy and irregular, like someone who'd been running. Then my own voice. "God, I'm so hungry I could eat a whole deer." I'd never said those words. I clicked the transmit button. "Who is this? How are you getting my voice?" The eating sounds stopped immediately. Dead silence for maybe 20 seconds. Then, "Who is this? How are you getting my voice?" My exact question, played back in my exact tone. I turned off the radio and threw it in my pack. The hunger was getting worse. I opened a package of beef jerky and ate the entire thing, then followed it with 2 energy bars and a bag of trail mix. Nothing helped. If anything, eating seemed to make the hollow feeling stronger. I managed to sleep a few hours, waking every time the wind shifted or a branch creaked nearby. Around dawn, I heard movement outside the tent. Footsteps circling the campsite, but moving differently than a human walk. Too fluid, like whatever was making them didn't need to worry about balance on the uneven snow. When I finally got up and checked the trail camera, The new footage made me start packing immediately. There I was at 4:30 a.m., going through my morning routine again. But this time the camera had caught me, the real me, sleeping in my tent at the exact same time. The timestamp showed. Both events happening simultaneously. Me asleep in the tent, me building up the fire 30 yards away. But what made me break camp in record time were the trees around my food cache. I'd hung my extra supplies in a bear bag about 50 yards from camp, standard backcountry protocol. The rope was still there, but the bag was gone, and the tree trunk showed deep scratches from ground level up to about 8 feet high. Claw marks running parallel in sets of 4. The scratches were fresh. White wood showing through dark bark, no weathering or snow accumulation in the grooves. As I snowshoed back toward the access road, the hunger became overwhelming. I stopped every few hundred yards to eat something, burning through my remaining food supplies. But no matter how much I consumed, I felt like I was starving. By the time I reached my truck, I'd eaten everything I had with me. 3 days' worth of emergency rations, gone in a 2-hour hike. My stomach felt full to the point of sickness, but the hollow ache remained. The drive back to Sudbury was a blur of stopping at every gas station and fast food place, eating mechanically while trying to understand what had happened in those woods. The trail camera footage was clear enough. I'd been in 2 places at once, or something had mimicked my routine so perfectly that even I couldn't tell the difference. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. Friends commented on my appetite, but I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. I still have the trail camera footage. Sometimes I watch it late at night, trying to spot the differences between my real morning routine and whatever performed it first. The movements are identical, the timing perfect, but there's something in the way the figure moves that doesn't quite look human. Too fluid, too purposeful, like something that had watched me very carefully and learned to be me better than I could be myself. The saw blades were singing my complaints about being hungry, even though all the equipment was shut down. Night maintenance at Penobscot Lumber meant working alone in a mill that processed thousands of board feet during the day, but fell silent after the last shift. My job was simple: repair and service equipment while it was powered down, prep everything for the morning crew. Usually took about 6 hours of methodical work in blessed quiet. This particular Thursday was different from the moment I clocked in. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift, pot roast, potatoes, the works, but walking through the main processing floor, I felt hollow, genuinely hungry, like I'd been skipping meals for days. I chalked it up to the physical work and cold air in the unheated building. All the saws were powered down per safety protocol, but as I started checking the main bandsaw for blade tension, I heard something that made me stop mid-adjustment. A low humming sound, almost musical, coming from the blade assembly, like wind through metal, except it formed words. God, I'm hungry. My exact phrase, in my exact tone, the same thing I'd muttered to myself while reviewing the work orders 20 minutes earlier. I tapped the blade with my wrench. Solid steel, completely motionless. No power running to the motor, but the humming continued, and now it carried a different phrase. I could eat everything in the break room. I'd said that too, joking to myself about my unusual appetite. The mill was laid out in 3 main sections: processing floor, storage, and administrative areas, with break rooms and offices. I worked my way through the equipment systematically, checking hydraulic fluid levels, greasing fittings, replacing worn belts. but the hunger was getting worse, making it hard to concentrate. Around midnight, I found footprints in the sawdust. Large prints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They led from the main floor toward the employee break room in a straight line, like whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. I followed the prints, my work boots silent on the sawdust-covered floor. The break room was in the administrative section, separated from the processing floor by a series of corridors and offices. The prints continued the entire way, clear and deep in the accumulated sawdust. The break room door was standing open, lights on inside. I definitely remembered that section being dark when I'd started my shift. Always checked it during my initial walkthrough. Always turned off any lights the day shift had left on. Inside, both refrigerators were open. Contents scattered across tables and floor. Lunchboxes had been torn apart. Containers opened and emptied. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with desperate efficiency. But what stopped me cold was the smell. Not spoiled food or spilled milk, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left in a warm place too long. I backed out of the break room and went to check the security station. The mill had cameras covering the main work areas, and I had access to review footage during my shift. What I found made my hands shake on the keyboard. The cameras showed me working on the equipment, moving through my normal maintenance routine, but the timestamps were wrong. According to the footage, I'd been servicing the planer unit at the exact same time I'd been adjusting the bandsaw. The video showed me in 2 different locations simultaneously. I rewound further and watched myself enter the break room and systematically consume everything edible, working with mechanical efficiency. But I remembered being on the processing floor during that entire time period, nowhere near the administrative section. The saw blade started humming again, louder now. Multiple voices this time, all my own voice, layering together. So hungry, could eat anything. Need more food, still empty. I walked back to the bandsaw and found scratches around the blade housing. Deep gouges in the metal casing, like something with claws had tried to get at the machinery inside. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the paint. My radio crackled to life. I carried one for safety purposes, to stay in contact with the security service that monitored the facility overnight. Static first, then sounds that made my stomach turn. Wet chewing, like someone eating something that required a lot of work. Between the eating sounds, my own voice. Not enough. Need more. Still hungry. I clicked the transmit button. Security. This is maintenance. Someone's in the building. The eating sound stopped immediately. Then my voice came through the speaker. Security. This is maintenance. Someone's in the building. Perfect mimicry of my transmission. I turned off the radio and clipped it back to my belt, but it activated again on its own a few minutes later. More eating sounds, more of my own voice saying things I didn't remember saying. The hunger was overwhelming now. I went back to the break room and found myself eating whatever remained from the earlier destruction. Crackers, candy from the vending machine I jimmied open, even condiment packets from fast food lunches. I ate mechanically, barely tasting anything, but the hollow feeling only got worse. Around 4 a.m., I found myself standing in the main processing area with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My tool bag was scattered around the bandsaw, and I'd apparently been working on it for hours. But I remembered being in the break room, eating everything I could find. The saw blade was humming constantly now, a low drone that formed words in my voice. More, need more, never enough, so hungry. I started my cleanup routine early, gathering tools and completing my paperwork by feel. The hunger was so intense I could barely focus on writing, but I needed to finish my shift and get out of there. The day shift supervisor found me in the parking lot an hour later, sitting in my truck with the heater running. He said I looked like I'd lost 20 pounds overnight, but my clothes were stained with food and my hands shook like I'd been drinking coffee for days straight. I couldn't explain the destroyed break room or the scratches on the equipment. I couldn't explain why the security footage showed me working in multiple locations simultaneously, or why every edible thing in the building had been consumed. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for weeks afterward, a constant ache that no amount of food could touch. I'd eat until I was sick, then feel empty again within an hour. I requested a transfer to day shift maintenance after that. Working alone in the mill at night wasn't something I could handle anymore, especially during the winter months when darkness fell early and stayed late. But sometimes, driving past the mill at night, I still hear the saw blades humming. Even when I know all the equipment is powered down, even when I'm miles away with the truck windows up and the radio playing, they're still singing about hunger in my voice, using words I never remember saying. The basement door was locked from the inside, but I lived alone and never went down there. House sitting, my cousin's mountain cabin in Vermont, seemed like the perfect winter writing retreat. 3 weeks of isolation, no responsibilities except keeping the pipes from freezing and the driveway plowed. The cabin was old but well maintained, with thick stone walls and a basement I'd been told was just storage. I'd never bothered checking it out. The entrance was through a heavy wooden door off the kitchen, and my cousin had mentioned it was mostly just the furnace and some old furniture. I had everything I needed on the main floor. The locked door situation started on my 4th day there. I'd been making coffee that morning when I noticed the basement door handle wouldn't turn. I tried my keyring, thinking maybe my cousin had locked it for security, but none of the keys fit. The door was definitely locked, and from the resistance I felt, it was locked from the inside. That was impossible. I'd been alone in the cabin, and I'd never gone down there. But what really bothered me was the hunger. Since arriving, I'd been eating constantly. Not snacking, actual meals, large portions, multiple times a day. I'd already gone through most of the groceries I'd brought for the entire week, and it was only Thursday. The eating sound started that night. Around 11 p.m., I heard what sounded like someone having dinner in the basement. Not conversation, just the sounds of eating. Methodical chewing, the scrape of utensils on plates, the occasional clink of glassware. Normal dinner sounds, except they were coming from a locked room I'd never entered. I pressed my ear to the basement door and listened. Definitely eating sounds, accompanied by what might have been breathing. Heavy, irregular breathing, like someone who was concentrating hard on their meal. I knocked on the door. The sound stopped immediately. Hello? Someone down there. Silence for about 30 seconds. Then my own voice, muffled but clear. Hello? Someone down there. Perfect mimicry of my question, delivered in my exact tone. I tried the door handle again, still locked from the inside. The sounds resumed a few minutes later, but now they included my voice. Comments about the food. This is good, and still hungry, and need more. Things I'd said to myself during meals over the past few days, played back in perfect detail. I spent the night on the couch in the living room. as far from the basement door as possible. But the sounds continued until dawn, eating, breathing, and occasional snippets of my own voice, talking about food and hunger. In the morning, I found scratches around the basement door frame, deep gouges in the wood, like something with claws had tried to work its way out. The scratches were fresh, bright wood showing through the old paint. They went up higher than I could reach, even standing on a chair. I called my cousin, but got voicemail. Left a message about the locked door and asked for advice. But I couldn't bring myself to mention the eating sounds or the voice mimicry. That sounded too crazy to put into words. Throughout the day, I heard my voice coming through the heating vents. Comments I'd made to myself while writing, complaints about being hungry, observations about the weather, always delivered in my exact tone, but always slightly delayed, like a bad satellite connection. The hunger was getting worse. I drove into town for more groceries, buying enough food for a family of 4. The cashier made a joke about stocking up for a blizzard, but I barely heard her. I was too focused on the gnawing emptiness that no amount of food seemed to touch. That evening, the power went out. Common enough in the mountains during winter, and the cabin had a generator. But before I could start it, I heard activity from the basement. Not just eating sounds now, but movement. Footsteps on what sounded like a concrete floor. Furniture being moved around, the scrape of heavy objects across stone. I used my phone's flashlight to check the basement door. Still locked, handle still refusing to turn, but light was coming from under the door. Not electric light, but something warmer, like candlelight or a fire. The sounds continued all night, eating, moving around, and my voice providing constant commentary. Not just things I'd said recently, but conversations from weeks ago, childhood memories I'd shared with friends, even thoughts I'd spoken aloud while writing. By morning, I'd eaten everything I'd bought the day before. Entire packages of food, consumed mechanically while listening to whatever was happening in the basement. But I felt emptier than ever, like I hadn't eaten in days. When the sun came up, I tried the basement door again. It opened easily. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with a stone floor and thick walls that looked original to the cabin. But it wasn't empty storage like my cousin had described. Someone had been living down there, a sleeping area set up in one corner with blankets and pillows arranged on an old couch, a makeshift kitchen area with camping equipment, portable stove, cooler, water jugs, and everywhere evidence of meals, empty food containers, dirty dishes, scraps and crumbs scattered across a folding table. But what made me start packing immediately were the scratches. Every surface showed claw marks, the walls, the ceiling, the furniture. Deep gouges, like something had been trapped down there and had tried to claw its way out. The scratches were everywhere except around the sleeping area, as if that one corner had been safe territory. I loaded my car in record time and drove straight back to Boston without stopping. Called my cousin from the road and told him I'd had a family emergency and needed to leave early. He was understanding, but mentioned something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. He said the basement door had been giving him trouble lately, sometimes locking itself from the inside. He'd been meaning to get it fixed, but had decided to just leave it alone for the winter. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. Friends commented on my appetite, but I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. What I also couldn't explain was the time discrepancy. According to my daily writing logs, I'd been productive every day at the cabin, completing pages of work during the exact hours I remembered being in the basement. Either I'd lost significant chunks of time, or I'd been in two places at once. I never went back to Vermont that winter, and I never house-sat another remote property during the cold months. Some kinds of isolation aren't worth the risk, especially when you can't be sure you're actually alone. Something was following me, matching my snowshoe rhythm perfectly, but staying just out of sight. 4 days into a solo winter expedition in Denali's backcountry, I'd settled into the hypnotic pace that long-distance snowshoeing requires. Left, right, pole plant, breathe. The rhythm becomes automatic after a while, letting your mind wander while your body maintains forward progress through deep snow. But on day 4, something else was keeping time with me. I first noticed it during a rest stop near Wonder Lake. I'd been traveling for about 3 hours when I stopped to check my GPS and adjust my pack straps. In the sudden silence after I stopped moving, I heard it clearly, the soft compression of snow under snowshoes, maintaining my exact rhythm for another 4 or 5 steps before stopping. Echo was possible in the mountains, but this sounded too close and too detailed, like someone was following my trail, matching my pace exactly. I called out, "Hello? Anyone back there?" The response came from behind me, but much closer than I'd expected. "Hello? Anyone back there?" My exact words, delivered in my exact tone, but with something slightly off about the timing. I turned around and studied my trail. Single set of snowshoe tracks leading back through the trees. Exactly what I'd expect from a solo hike. But the snow around the trail showed signs of disturbance, like something large had been moving parallel to my route without leaving clear prints. The hunger had been getting worse since day 2. Despite eating high-calorie trail food regularly, I felt constantly empty. Not just tired from the physical exertion, but genuinely hungry, like I'd been skipping meals for days. I resumed my pace, trying to focus on navigation and campsite selection. But the following footsteps continued, maintaining perfect rhythm with my snowshoes. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I stopped, they took exactly 4 more steps before stopping. Around noon, I heard my own voice calling from somewhere in the trees. "Jesus, I'm so hungry I could eat a moose." Something I'd muttered to myself earlier that morning while breaking camp. I stopped hiking and listened carefully. The forest was quiet except for the occasional crack of trees adjusting to temperature changes. Then, from a different direction, "This cold is killing me." Another complaint I'd made to myself while putting on extra layers. The voice was definitely mine, but the words were being delivered slightly wrong. Too slow, or with pauses in the wrong places. Like someone learning to speak by copying recorded phrases. I made camp early that day, choosing a clearing with good visibility in all directions. As I set up my winter tent, I noticed that some of my trail markers had moved. I'd been using reflective tape on trees to mark my route, standard practice for solo winter travel, but several pieces of tape that I'd placed at eye level were now 10 or 12 feet up the trunks, well above where I could reach even with my trekking poles. The following footsteps continued around my campsite throughout the evening, circling at a consistent distance, always matching whatever rhythm I was moving to. Whether I was gathering firewood, organizing gear, or walking to my food cache. That night, I heard eating sounds, not from my campsite, but from somewhere in the darkness beyond my fire's reach. Methodical chewing, like someone working through tough jerky or frozen food. The sounds continued for hours, accompanied by my own voice providing commentary. Still hungry, and need more, and not enough. I'd never said those exact phrases. In the morning, my food cache was empty. I'd suspended it properly. Bear bag technique, high and away from tree trunks. The bag was still there, but every container inside had been opened and emptied. My remaining 3 days of food, gone. But what made me start my emergency evacuation were the claw marks. Deep gouges in the trees around my campsite, starting about 8 feet up and running to 12 or 13 feet high. Parallel scratches in sets of 4, like something with massive claws had been marking territory. The scratches were fresh, bright wood showing through dark bark. I broke camp immediately and started back toward the access road, pushing a pace that was probably unsafe for solo winter travel. But the following footsteps continued, and now they seemed closer. The rhythm matched mine perfectly, but I could hear the compression of snow under snowshoes just a few yards behind me. Every time I stopped to rest, my voice would call out from the trees. Questions like, "Where are you going?" And statements like, "Still so hungry," always delivered in my tone, but with that slightly wrong timing that made my skin crawl. The hunger was overwhelming now. I ate my emergency food supplies while hiking, consuming everything I had left. Energy bars, jerky, even the electrolyte powder I mixed with snow. But no matter how much I ate, the hollow feeling got worse. By the time I reached my truck, I'd been without food for 6 hours, but felt like I'd been starving for days. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The drive back to Fairbanks was a blur of stopping at every gas station and restaurant, eating mechanically while trying to understand what had happened in the backcountry. The following footsteps, the voice mimicry, the move trail markers, none of it made sense. But what really bothered me was my GPS data. According to the device, I'd covered impossible distances during the nights I'd been sleeping in my tent. Miles of travel logged during hours when I distinctly remembered being zipped into my sleeping bag. Either the GPS was malfunctioning, or I'd been moving around the wilderness while unconscious. Neither explanation was comforting. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. The doctor I consulted couldn't find anything wrong, but recommended psychological evaluation for what he called possible trauma response. I never told him about the voice mimicry or the move trail markers. How do you explain that something in the wilderness had learned to be you better than you could be yourself? I still have the GPS data from that trip. Sometimes I load it into mapping software and trace the routes it recorded. During the day, logical paths between campsites and landmarks. During the night, wandering patterns that cover enormous areas, like something was searching the entire region systematically. I never went back to Denali for winter camping, and I never traveled solo in the Alaska backcountry again, especially during the months when daylight is limited and the hunger of winter makes everything desperate. Some kinds of isolation aren't worth the risk, no matter how beautiful the country. The loading bay doors kept opening by themselves, but the delivery schedule showed nothing until morning. Night shift at Traverse Bay Medical Center's receiving dock was usually quiet work. Most deliveries came during business hours, leaving the overnight crew to handle emergencies and prepare for the next day's shipments. I'd been working the dock for 3 years, and the routine was predictable. Check inventory, organize storage areas, handle the occasional urgent delivery. This particular Wednesday started wrong from the moment I clocked in. The main loading bay doors were cycling open and closed every few minutes, their hydraulic systems whining as they lifted and lowered. I checked the control panel. No active delivery requests, no trucks in the bay, sensors showing clear. But the doors kept activating, like something was triggering the motion detectors. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift, but walking through the receiving area, I felt genuinely hungry. Not snacky hungry, but empty, like I'd been skipping meals. I grabbed a protein bar from my lunch bag and ate it while reviewing the night's work orders. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing sounds from the loading bay. Not machinery sounds. I knew all those by heart. This was something else. Scratching, like someone dragging fingernails across metal. Then, what sounded like chewing, wet and methodical, echoing off the concrete walls of the empty bay. I walked over to investigate, my footsteps loud in the quiet space. The bay was empty except for some pallets of medical supplies scheduled for morning distribution. But the sounds continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called out, "Security? Someone in the loading area?" The scratching stopped immediately. Then, after about 10 seconds, my own voice echoed back, "Security? Someone in the loading area." Perfect mimicry, but with something wrong about the timing. I radioed the security desk. "This is receiving dock. Can you check the loading bay cameras?" Static then. "This is receiving dock. Can you check the loading bay cameras?" My exact transmission, played back in my exact voice. I walked to the security station and reviewed the camera footage myself. The monitors showed me moving through the receiving area, checking inventory, organizing supplies. But the timestamps were wrong. According to the cameras, I'd been working in the pharmaceutical storage room at the exact same time I'd been in the loading bay. The footage showed me, or something that looked exactly like me, moving through restricted areas I didn't have access to. The figure walked with my gait, wore my uniform, even carried my clipboard, but it was checking areas that weren't part of my normal routine. Around midnight, the hospital's intercom system activated. "Good evening, this is receiving dock," in my voice. But I was nowhere near the intercom controls. The announcement continued. "I'm so hungry I could eat everything in the cafeteria." I'd never made that announcement, had never used the intercom system at all. I decided to check the employee cafeteria, which was on my list of areas to secure during night rounds. The walk took me through several corridors and past the main elevator bank. As I passed the elevators, one opened without being called, the doors sliding apart to reveal an empty car. The cafeteria was destroyed, not vandalized, systematically ransacked. Every refrigerator and freezer door hung open, contents scattered across tables and floor. The serving line had been torn apart, industrial-sized containers of food emptied and discarded. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with desperate efficiency. But what made my radio shake in my hand was the smell. Not spoiled food or spilled liquids, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left in a warm place for days. I radioed security again. "Cafeteria's been hit. Major damage, all the food's gone." No response except static. I tried again. "Security, please respond. We have a situation in the cafeteria." After a few seconds, my own voice came through the radio. "Security, please respond. We have a situation in the cafeteria." But I could hear eating sounds in the background of the transmission. I went back to the receiving dock and found more evidence of activity. The pharmaceutical refrigeration unit showed deep scratches around the door handles and locks. Claw marks, like something had tried to break into the medication storage. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the painted surfaces. The loading bay doors were still cycling open and closed, but now I could see why. Something was triggering the motion sensors from inside the bay, moving back and forth in a pattern that kept the doors activating. I positioned myself where I could watch the sensors without being detected. Around 2 a.m., I saw it. A figure moving through the loading bay, tall and gaunt, checking every corner and storage area. It moved exactly like me. Same height, same methodical pattern I used during inventory checks. But it was too thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. When it turned toward my hiding spot, I saw my own face, but wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been stretched or distorted. The features were right, but the proportions were off. I backed away slowly and went to the break room to think. The hunger was overwhelming now, making it hard to focus on anything else. I opened the vending machines with my key and ate everything I could find. Candy bars, chips, sandwiches, energy drinks. But no matter how much I consumed, the hollow feeling got worse. Around 4 a.m., I found myself in the cafeteria again, surrounded by empty containers and food packaging. I had no memory of going back there, no memory of eating most of what was scattered around me. My uniform was stained with food, and I felt sick but still hungry. The morning shift supervisor found me there an hour later. She said I looked like I'd lost significant weight overnight, despite the evidence of a feeding frenzy all around me. I couldn't explain the destroyed cafeteria or the scratches on the refrigeration units. I couldn't explain why the security footage showed me in multiple locations simultaneously, or why the intercom system had broadcast announcements in my voice. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for weeks afterward, a constant ache that no amount of food could touch. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. I requested a transfer to day shift after that. Working alone in the hospital at night wasn't something I could handle anymore, especially in the receiving areas where deliveries could arrive unscheduled. But sometimes, driving past the medical center late at night, I still see the loading bay doors cycling open and closed. Even when I know there are no deliveries scheduled. Even when the parking lot is empty except for a few staff cars. And I still hear my own voice on random radio frequencies, making announcements about hunger that I never remember making. The kitchen timer kept going off every few minutes, but I'd never set it, and the display was blank. I'd rented the ski lodge for a month-long writing retreat, choosing February because the rates were low, and I needed complete isolation to finish my novel. The place was perfect. 3 bedrooms, full kitchen, and miles from the nearest neighbor in New Hampshire's White Mountains. The timer situation started on my 3rd day there. I was working at the kitchen table when a sharp beeping cut through the quiet. The digital timer on the stove was flashing zeros, making the insistent sound that meant something was done cooking. But I hadn't been cooking anything, hadn't touched the timer controls at all. I pressed the reset button and went back to writing. 20 minutes later, it went off again. Same pattern, flashing zeros, urgent beeping, but no time displayed when I checked it. By evening, the timer was going off every few minutes. I started timing the intervals and noticed something that made my skin crawl. The beeping matched my resting heart rate almost exactly. When I was calm, it beeped every second or so. When I got frustrated with my writing, the intervals shortened. I'd been hungrier than usual since arriving at the lodge. Despite eating large meals, I felt constantly empty. Real hunger, the kind that makes your hands shake and your stomach ache. I'd already gone through most of the groceries I'd brought for the week. That night, I heard my own voice coming from the living room. God, I'm so hungry, in my exact tone. The same complaint I'd muttered to myself while making dinner an hour earlier. I walked to the living room and found all the furniture turned around. The couch, chairs, and coffee table had been repositioned to face the kitchen, like an audience waiting for a performance. I distinctly remembered arranging everything to face the fireplace when I'd arrived. From the bedroom upstairs, my voice again. I could eat everything in this place. Another thing I'd said to myself, joking about my increased appetite. I called out, "Hello? Someone up there?" Silence for a moment. Then, "Hello? Someone up there?" Perfect mimicry of my question, but with a slight delay, like an echo with wrong timing. The kitchen timer went off again, and I noticed my heart rate had increased. The beeping was faster now, matching my elevated pulse exactly. I unplugged the stove, but the timer kept working, its display dark but still beeping in rhythm with my heartbeat. I tried removing the batteries from the unit, but the sound continued, now seeming to come from inside the walls. Around midnight, I found the refrigerator standing open. I definitely closed it after getting a late snack. But now the door hung wide and most of the contents were gone. Not taken, consumed. Empty containers and packages scattered across the kitchen counter, as if someone had eaten everything systematically and quickly. I had no memory of that feeding session, but my stomach felt full, and I could taste various foods in my mouth. Yet the hollow hunger remained, stronger than ever. The timer was beeping constantly now, a rapid pulse that matched my racing heart. I tried to slow my breathing, and the timer slowed with it. When I held my breath, it stopped entirely. From upstairs, eating sounds, wet chewing, like someone working through something tough. The sounds were accompanied by my voice providing commentary, still hungry, and need more, and not enough. I'd never said those exact phrases. I went upstairs to investigate and found the master bedroom rearranged. The bed had been moved to face the hallway, and the dresser mirror was angled to reflect the kitchen downstairs. Like someone had set up a viewing area to watch the kitchen table. But what made me start packing was the pantry door. Deep scratches covered the wood around the handle and lock. Claw marks running parallel in sets of 4. The scratches went from floor level up to about 7 feet high, like something tall had tried to claw its way into the food storage. Inside the pantry, everything was gone. A week's worth of canned goods, dry foods, snacks, consumed. Empty containers were stacked neatly on the shelves, as if someone had been very organized about their feeding. The kitchen timer was shrieking now, a continuous alarm that matched my panic-elevated heart rate. I tried smashing it with a hammer, but the sound continued from every appliance in the kitchen. The microwave, dishwasher, even the coffee maker were all beeping in unison with my pulse. I threw my belongings into my car and drove back to Boston without stopping. The timer sounds followed me for the first hour of the drive, seeming to come from the car radio even when it was turned off. The rental company called a few days later asking about the damaged pantry door and the missing food supplies. I told them I'd had some kind of medical episode and couldn't remember details. What I didn't tell them was that I was still hungry. Constantly, overwhelmingly hungry, no matter how much I ate. And my heart rate stayed elevated for weeks, like my body was stuck in a permanent state of panic. The worst part was the timing. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I'd hear that same beeping pattern. Not from any appliance, from inside my own chest, like my heart was trying to count down to something. I never finished the novel I went there to write. Every time I tried to work on it, I'd hear that timer beeping, and remember the feeling of consuming massive amounts of food with no memory of eating. And I never rented another isolated place during winter months. Some kinds of solitude aren't worth the risk, especially when you can't be sure what's actually keeping you company. Something kept taking my bait, but when I reeled in, there were teeth marks on the hooks that were too big for any fish. February along the Salmon River meant cold weather fishing, but the steelhead runs were worth the discomfort. I'd found a good camping spot about 2 miles downstream from the nearest road access, far enough from civilization to have the water to myself. The first strange thing happened on my second morning there. I'd been fishing a deep pool where the current slowed, using spawn sacks that usually drove steelhead crazy. Something hit my line hard, nearly pulling the rod from my hands. But when I set the hook and started reeling, there was no fight, just dead weight, like I'd hooked a log. When I brought the line in, the hook was mangled, not broken, crushed, like something with massive jaws had bitten down on it. The steel was bent and scored with deep gouges that looked like teeth marks. No fish in these waters had teeth that could do that kind of damage. I rigged up again and cast to the same spot. Within minutes, another hard strike, another destroyed hook. This time, I could see scratch marks on the steel that ran parallel, like whatever had bitten the hook had multiple rows of teeth. The hunger started that afternoon. Despite eating a full lunch, I felt genuinely empty, not just tired from the cold air and physical activity, but hungry in a way that made my hands shake. I ate dinner early and followed it with energy bars, but the hollow feeling only got worse. Around sunset, I heard splashing from the river, not fish jumping, something larger moving through the shallows. I grabbed my headlamp and walked to the bank, sweeping the beam across the water. The splashing stopped immediately, but I could see disturbed water where something had been moving just moments before. That night, my voice started echoing across the river. "These fish aren't biting," came from the opposite bank. My exact words from earlier that day, delivered in my exact frustrated tone. I called out, "Hello? Someone over there?" The response came back immediately. "Hello? Someone over there," but with something wrong about the timing, like the words were being played back at slightly the wrong speed. Then, from a different location, "I'm so hungry I could eat the whole river." Something I joked to myself about while setting up camp. I built up my fire and kept it burning bright, but the voice mimicry continued throughout the night. Comments about the cold, complaints about the fishing, even observations about the weather, all things I'd said to myself over the past 2 days, played back in perfect detail. In the morning, my food cache was empty. I'd hung everything properly in a bear bag, high and away from tree trunks. The bag was still there, but every container inside had been opened and consumed. 3 days' worth of food, gone overnight. But what made me check my fishing gear was the smell coming from the riverbank. Not fish or river water, but something organic and wrong, like meat left in a warm place for too long. I found tracks in the mud along the water's edge, large prints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They led from the water up to my campsite, circled the fire ring, then went back to the river. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground near the bank. I rigged up my heaviest tackle and cast into the deep pool again. Whatever was down there hit immediately, but this time I didn't try to set the hook. I just held on and let it take line. The drag screamed as something massive moved upstream, then down, then across the current. Not like any fish I'd ever hooked. More like something that was testing the line, learning how it worked. When the line finally went slack, I reeled in to find not just a destroyed hook, but several feet of leader line that looked like it had been chewed through. The cut ends were frayed and wet, with what might have been saliva. The hunger was overwhelming now. I ate my emergency food supplies while breaking camp, consuming everything I had left. Energy bars, jerky, even the hot chocolate powder mixed with river water. But no matter how much I ate, the hollow feeling got worse. As I packed my gear, I heard movement in the water again. Not splashing this time, but the sound of something large wading through the shallows. I looked up to see a figure standing in the river about 50 yards downstream. Tall and impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was facing my direction, but I couldn't make out details from that distance. What I could see was that it was holding something that looked like a fishing rod. I called out, "Hey, you okay over there?" The figure raised what might have been a hand, waving in exactly the same way I waved when greeting other anglers. Then it called back, "Hey, you okay over there?" My exact words, in my exact tone. But when it spoke, I could see that his mouth was wrong. Too wide, opening much farther than a human mouth should. And when it closed, I caught a glimpse of too many teeth. I loaded my truck in record time and drove straight back to Boise without stopping. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw the figure following along the riverbank, keeping pace with the truck despite the rough terrain. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. Friends commented on my appetite, but I couldn't explain the constant ache that no amount of food could touch. What I also couldn't explain was my fishing gear. When I unpacked my truck, I found hooks in my tackle box that I'd never seen before. Massive treble hooks, bent and twisted like they'd been tested by something with incredible jaw strength. I never went back to that section of the Salmon River, and I never fished alone during winter months again, especially in remote areas where the water runs deep and cold. Some kinds of fishing aren't worth the risk, no matter how good the reports say the bite is. The conveyor system kept running even though I'd shut down all the power, and it was carrying something that wasn't grain. Night maintenance at Highline Grain Elevator meant working alone in a facility that processed thousands of tons during harvest season, but stood mostly empty through the winter months. My job was simple: check equipment, maintain the conveyor systems, and prepare everything for spring operations. I'd shut down all the power systems when I arrived for my shift, standard safety protocol for maintenance work. But walking through the main processing floor, I could hear the conveyors running. The rubber belts were moving at normal speed, carrying loads from the storage silos toward the loading docks. But instead of grain, they were transporting something else. Dark material that looked organic, wet, and wrong. Like chunks of meat moving through a system designed for wheat and corn. I checked the main electrical panel. Everything was switched off. Breakers open. No power flowing to the conveyor motors. But the belts kept moving, and the strange material kept flowing through the system. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift, but standing there watching the conveyors, I felt genuinely hungry. Not just empty stomach hungry, but hollow, like I'd been skipping meals for days. The feeling was so intense it made me dizzy. The facility intercom crackled to life around 10 p.m. Maintenance to loading dock, in my own voice. But I was standing in the processing area, nowhere near the intercom controls. The announcement continued. "I'm so hungry I could eat everything in storage." I'd never made that announcement, had never used the intercom system at all. I walked to the control room to check the communication equipment and found the office destroyed. Not vandalized, systematically ransacked. Every desk drawer had been pulled out and emptied. Filing cabinets stood open, and the small refrigerator that held employee lunches was completely empty. Food containers and packages were scattered across the floor, all of them opened and consumed. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with desperate efficiency. But what made my hands shake was the smell. Not spoiled food or spilled coffee, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left in a warm place for too long. The conveyors were still running, that strange dark material flowing through the system in a continuous stream. I followed one of the belts to see where it was coming from, and found myself at the base of silo number 3. The access door was standing open, massive hinges creaking in the wind. I definitely checked that all the silos were sealed when I'd started my shift. But now the door hung wide, and the conveyor system was drawing material from inside. I grabbed my flashlight and looked into the silo. Instead of grain, I saw what looked like the remains of something large, not fresh, old, dried, but somehow still moving through the mechanical systems as if it were flowing grain. My radio crackled with static, then my own voice. Control room to maintenance. But I was standing at the silo, not in the control room. The transmission continued. Still hungry. Need more. I'd never said those words. I walked back toward the control room and found scratch marks around every door and access panel. Deep gouges in the metal, like something with claws had tried to get into every storage area in the facility. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the paint. The hunger was overwhelming now. I opened every vending machine in the break area and ate everything I could find. Candy bars, chips, sandwiches that had been there for weeks. But no matter how much I consumed, the hollow feeling got worse. Around midnight, I found myself operating the grain loading equipment. I had no memory of starting the machinery, no memory of climbing up to the control booth. But I was running the conveyors at full speed, directing that strange dark material through the cleaning systems and into the loading bays. My hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, as if I'd been doing this work for years instead of just maintaining the equipment. The material flowed through the system in massive quantities, much more than any single silo could hold. The facility intercom was broadcasting continuously now, my voice providing running commentary on the loading process. But I wasn't speaking, wasn't anywhere near the microphone. The announcements talked about hunger, about never having enough, about needing to process more material. I tried to shut down the system, but the controls wouldn't respond. Every switch I threw, every button I pressed, the machinery kept running. The conveyors moved that dark material in an endless stream, and my voice kept announcing its progress over the intercom. Around 4 a.m., I found myself in silo number 7, surrounded by the strange material. I had no memory of entering the silo, no memory of climbing down the access ladder, but I was standing waist deep in the organic matter, and it was moving around me like a living thing. The material wasn't grain. It was something that had once been alive, processed through the facility's machinery until it became something else entirely, and I was consuming it, eating handfuls of it mechanically, while my voice echoed through the facility speakers. The morning shift supervisor found me there an hour later, unconscious in the bottom of the silo. He said I looked like I'd lost significant weight overnight, despite being covered in the organic material. I couldn't explain the ransacked control room or the scratches on the access doors. I couldn't explain why the conveyor systems had been running all night without power, or why the facility intercom had been broadcasting in my voice. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for weeks afterward, a constant ache that no amount of normal food could touch. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. I requested a transfer to day shift and maintenance after that. Working alone in the grain elevator at night wasn't something I could handle anymore, especially during the winter months when the silo stood empty and the machinery should have been silent. But sometimes, driving past the facility late at night, I still hear the conveyors running, even when I know all the power is shut off, even when I know the silos are empty, and I still hear my voice on the facility's emergency radio frequency, providing updates on processing operations that should have ended months ago. The ice fishing hole in the lake kept making sounds like someone eating, even though it was frozen solid. The lake house rental was perfect for a winter writing retreat. Isolated, affordable, and completely quiet, except for the occasional crack of shifting ice. I'd arrived in early February with plans to spend 3 weeks finishing my novel, using the frozen lake view for inspiration. The ice hole had been left by the previous renters, a neat circular opening about 2 feet across, kept from freezing over by a small aerator system. I planned to try some ice fishing, but first I wanted to get settled and establish a writing routine. The eating sounds started on my second night there. Around 9 p.m., I heard what sounded like someone having dinner outside. Not conversation, just the sounds of eating, methodical chewing, the scrape of utensils, the occasional satisfied sigh. The sounds were coming from the direction of the lake. I looked out the kitchen window toward the ice hole. Nothing visible in the darkness, but the eating sounds continued. Wet, purposeful sounds, like someone working through a large meal. I'd been hungrier than usual since arriving at the lake house. Despite eating regular meals, I felt constantly empty. Real hunger, the kind that makes your hands shake and your stomach ache. I'd already made 2 trips to the grocery store in 3 days. That night, I heard my own voice coming from the ice hole. God, I'm so hungry, echoing up from the water below. My exact words from earlier that evening, delivered in my exact frustrated tone. I put on my coat and walked down to the lake with a flashlight. The ice hole was about 50 yards from the house, dark water visible in the circular opening. As I approached, the eating sound stopped. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone down there?" My own voice answered from beneath the ice. "Hello? Someone down there?" Perfect mimicry, but with something wrong about the acoustics, like the words were coming from much deeper than they should. I shined my flashlight into the hole. The water was dark and still, maybe 8 feet deep, judging by what I could see. But as I watched, something pale moved just below the surface, like a large fish or... I backed away quickly and went inside. The next morning, I found all the living room furniture turned around to face the lake. The couch, chairs, and coffee table had been repositioned to create a perfect viewing area aimed at the ice hole. I distinctly remembered arranging everything to face the fireplace when I'd arrived. From the ice hole, my voice again. I could eat everything in this house, something I joked to myself about while making breakfast. The hunger was getting worse. I ate a large lunch and followed it with snacks, but the hollow feeling only intensified. I made another grocery run and bought enough food for a week, though I couldn't explain why I felt so urgently hungry. That afternoon, while writing at the kitchen table, I heard movement under the ice. Not fish, something large, moving with purpose beneath the frozen surface. The sounds followed a pattern, like something was swimming back and forth along the shoreline, staying just under the ice. Around sunset, the eating sounds resumed from the ice hole, but now they were accompanied by my voice providing commentary. Still hungry, and need more, and not enough. I'd never said those exact phrases. I built a fire in the fireplace and tried to focus on my writing, but the sounds from the lake were constant now. Eating, moving around under the ice, and my own voice talking about food and hunger in words I didn't remember saying. Around midnight, I found the kitchen destroyed. Every cabinet and the refrigerator had been opened and emptied. Food packages were scattered across the counters and floor, all of them opened and consumed. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with systematic efficiency. I had no memory of that feeding session, but my stomach felt full, and I could taste various foods in my mouth. Yet the hollow hunger remained, stronger than ever. From the ice hole, my voice was calling, "More, need more, never enough." I looked out the window and saw something that made me start packing immediately. A figure was sitting at the edge of the ice hole, dangling its legs in the dark water. Tall and impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was facing the house, and even from a distance, I could tell it was watching me. As I watched, it raised what might have been a hand and waved. The same casual greeting I used when acknowledging neighbors. Then it called out, "Come down here!" Still so hungry. My exact voice, but I'd never said those words. I loaded my car in the dark and drove back to Milwaukee without stopping. As I pulled away from the lake house, I heard the ice beginning to crack. Loud snaps and groans, like the frozen surface was breaking apart. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the ice hole, water up to its waist, still waving in my direction. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. My doctor couldn't find anything wrong, but I felt like I was starving constantly. What I also couldn't explain was my writing. When I reviewed the pages I'd written at the lake house, they weren't about my novel at all. Page after page of descriptions of hunger, of never having enough, of needing to consume everything. Written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing any of it. I never went back to that lake house, and I never rented another isolated place during winter months. Some kinds of solitude aren't worth the risk, especially when the ice is thick enough to hide what's moving underneath. Every time I use my tent zipper, something in the forest zipped back in perfect rhythm. 7 days into a solo winter expedition in Quebec's boreal forest, I'd grown comfortable with the routine sounds of wilderness camping. The crack of settling ice, wind through spruce boughs, the occasional distant howl of wolves. But on day 7, the forest started responding to me. It began with my tent zipper. Each time I opened or closed the vestibule, I heard an answering zip from somewhere in the trees. Not an echo, too delayed for that, and coming from different directions each time. Like something was mimicking the sound deliberately. I tested it that evening while making dinner. Zip open, pause, answering zip from the tree line to my left. Zip closed, pause, answering zip from behind my tent. The timing was perfect, like something was learning the rhythm and playing it back. The hunger had been getting worse each day. Despite eating high-calorie camping food regularly, I felt constantly hollow. Not just tired from the physical exertion of traveling through deep snow, but genuinely starving, like I'd been without food for weeks. I'd already consumed most of my supplies for the entire trip. and I was only halfway through my planned route. That night, my voice started calling from the forest. "This cold is brutal," came from somewhere among the spruces. My exact words from earlier that day, delivered in my exact frustrated tone. I called out, "Hello? Someone out there?" The response came immediately, "Hello? Someone out there?" but with something wrong about the delivery, like the words were being spoken by someone who was learning the language. Then, from a different direction, "I'm so hungry I could eat tree bark." A joke I'd made to myself while setting up camp. I added more wood to my fire and kept it burning bright, but the voice mimicry continued throughout the night. Comments about the cold, complaints about being hungry, even observations about the weather. All things I'd said to myself over the past week, played back in perfect detail. In the morning, my entire campsite was rearranged, not destroyed, reorganized. My gear had been moved into a perfect circle around the fire ring, each item positioned with mathematical precision. My snowshoes were planted upright in the snow like fence posts. My trekking poles had been crossed and stuck into a snowbank to form an X, but what stopped me cold were my trail markers. I'd been using reflective tape on trees to mark my route, standard practice for solo winter travel, but several pieces of tape that I'd placed at eye level were now 15 or 20 feet up the trunks, attached to branches I couldn't possibly reach. The tape hadn't been moved. The branches had been bent down to ground level, tagged, then allowed to spring back up to their natural height. From the forest, my voice again. What the hell happened here? The exact question I'd just asked aloud. I broke camp quickly and resumed my route, but the mimicry followed me. Every sound I made, zipper, buckle clicks, the crunch of snowshoes on snow, was answered from the tree line, and my voice provided constant commentary using phrases I'd spoken over the past week. The hunger was overwhelming now. I ate my remaining emergency food while hiking, consuming everything I had left. Energy bars, jerky, even the electrolyte powder mixed with snow. But no matter how much I ate, the hollow feeling got worse. Around noon, I heard movement parallel to my route. Something large, keeping pace with me through the trees. When I stopped, it stopped. When I changed direction, it changed direction, but always staying just out of sight. My tent zipper sound echoed from the forest continuously now, like something was opening and closing an invisible tent in rhythm with my movements. I made camp early, choosing a clearing with good visibility. As I set up my tent, every sound I made was answered. Zipper pulls, stake hammering, even the rustle of my sleeping bag being arranged. But when I looked at my tent after setting it up, I found claw marks in the fabric, deep scratches running along the rainfly, like something with massive talons had raked across the material. The scratches were fresh, the fabric torn in parallel lines, but I'd been watching the tent the entire time I was setting it up. That night, the sounds got worse. Not just mimicry now, but improvement. The zipper sounds from the forest were faster, smoother, more efficient than my own clumsy cold weather efforts, like something was perfecting my technique. Around midnight, I saw it. A figure at the edge of my fire's light, setting up what looked like an exact copy of my tent. Same color, same size, same methodical process I used. But the figure was wrong, too tall, too thin, moving with fluid precision that didn't look human. When it finished with the tent, it began mimicking my entire evening routine, lighting a stove that wasn't there, stirring food that didn't exist, even the motions of eating and drinking, all performed with exaggerated precision, like a caricature of camping. I called out, "What do you want?" The figure stopped its mime performance and looked directly at me. In my own voice it said, "I'm so hungry. Need more. Never enough." Then it began eating, not food itself, starting with its fingers and working methodically through its hands, then its arms, but instead of getting smaller, it seemed to grow larger with each bite. I ran, left everything behind and ran through the forest in the dark, following my GPS toward the nearest road access. Behind me I could hear the sound of my tent being zipped and unzipped repeatedly, faster and faster, like someone practicing the motion obsessively. The drive to Quebec City was a blur of stopping at every restaurant and gas station, eating mechanically while trying to understand what had happened in those woods. The voice mimicry, the rearranged camp, the thing that had learned to be a better camper than I was. But what really bothered me was my GPS data. According to the device, I'd covered impossible distances during the nights I'd been sleeping in my tent. Miles of travel logged during hours when I distinctly remembered being zipped into my sleeping bag. The hunger didn't fade for weeks. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. My doctor recommended psychiatric evaluation, suggesting the isolation had triggered some kind of breakdown. I never told him about the figure at my campsite or the way it had improved on my camping technique while consuming itself. How do you explain that something in the wilderness had learned to be you, but better? I still have the torn tent fabric. Sometimes I examine the claw marks under magnification, trying to understand what could make scratches that precise and deep. The fabric is high-tech material, designed to resist tearing, but the scratches go clean through multiple layers. I never went back to the boreal forest for solo camping, and I never used that tent design again. The zipper sound triggers something in my memory that makes me instantly overwhelmingly hungry. Some kinds of wilderness experience change you permanently, and not always for the better. The ore chutes kept dropping loads, even though the mine was shut down, and they sounded exactly like my stomach growling. Night maintenance at the Mesabi Range iron mine meant working alone in a facility that had been shuttered for 2 years, but still needed basic upkeep. My job was simple: check equipment, prevent theft, and maintain the structural integrity of the shafts and processing buildings. The mine had been closed due to falling iron prices, but the machinery was kept in working condition in case operations resumed. Most nights I'd walk through the facility, check fluid levels, grease fittings, and monitor the pumps that kept the deeper shafts from flooding. This particular Thursday was different from the moment I arrived. The ore chutes were active, dropping loads from the upper levels down to the processing floor. I could hear the rumble and crash of material falling through the metal chutes, but the conveyor systems were powered down, and there was no ore left in the facility. I checked the main electrical panel. Everything was switched off per protocol. No power flowing to the ore handling systems, but the chutes kept operating, and the sounds they made were wrong. Instead of the sharp clatter of iron ore, they produced deep, hollow rumbles that sounded exactly like stomach growling. The same sound my stomach had been making all evening, amplified through the metal chute system. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift, but standing there listening to the chutes, I felt genuinely starving. Not just hungry, empty in a way that made my hands shake and my vision blur, like I hadn't eaten in days instead of hours. The mine's communication system crackled to life around 10 p.m. Maintenance to shaft 7, in my own voice. But I was standing in the processing building, nowhere near the communication controls. The announcement continued. So hungry, need to feed the operation. I'd never made that announcement. had never used the mine's PA system at all. I walked to the control room and found evidence of activity. The break room refrigerators were standing open, contents scattered across tables and floor. Lunchboxes had been torn apart, vending machines had been forced open, even the coffee supplies had been consumed. Everything edible in the facility was gone. But what made my hands shake was the systematic nature of it. Whoever had done this had opened every container methodically, consumed the contents, then stacked the empties in neat piles, like someone had been very organized about their feeding. The ore chutes were getting louder, those stomach-growling sounds echoing through the entire facility. I followed the sound to shaft 7 and found the access door standing open. I definitely checked that all the shaft entrances were sealed when I'd started my shift, but now the heavy steel door hung wide, and I could hear activity coming from deep underground. The mine communication system was broadcasting continuously now, my voice providing updates on operations that had stopped 2 years ago. Ore flow looking good, and production levels optimal, and still hungry for more material. I radioed the security service that monitored the facility overnight. "This is night maintenance. Possible intruder in the mine shafts." My own voice came back through the radio. "This is night maintenance. Possible intruder in the mine shafts." But I could hear the ore chutes rumbling in the background of the transmission. I grabbed my flashlight and mining helmet and started down into shaft 7. The cage elevator was working despite having no power, descending smoothly into the darkness. As I went deeper, the stomach-growling sounds got louder. At the 200-foot level, I found the source. The ore chutes were full of something that wasn't iron ore. Dark, organic material that moved through the system like it was alive. And standing at the chute controls was a figure that looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same mining company uniform, but impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was operating the chute system with practiced efficiency, directing the organic material through the processing equipment. When it saw me, it waved the same casual greeting I used when acknowledging other workers. Then it spoke in my voice. "Finally. Been so hungry down here. Help me feed the operation." I backed toward the elevator, but it wasn't there anymore. The shaft extended down into darkness far deeper than the mine had ever been excavated, and the organic material in the chutes was flowing upward now, against gravity, like it was being drawn towards something on the surface. The figure at the controls was consuming the material as it flowed past, eating handfuls of it mechanically. But instead of getting fuller, it seemed to grow hungrier with each bite. "Never enough," it said in my voice. "The operation needs more. Always more." I found a maintenance ladder and climbed toward the surface, the stomach-growling sounds of the chutes following me up. Behind me, I could hear the figure starting the larger processing equipment, machinery that had been shut down for years roaring to life. I reached the surface and ran for my truck, but the hunger was overwhelming now. I stopped at the facility vending area and used my key to open every machine, eating everything I could find. Candy bars, chips, energy drinks, even stale sandwiches from months ago. But no matter how much I consumed, the hollow feeling got worse. The mine's PA system was broadcasting continuously now, my voice providing commentary on processing operations. But the words weren't about iron ore. They were about hunger, about feeding, about never having enough material to satisfy the operation. I drove straight to Duluth without stopping, the hunger so intense I could barely focus on the road. At every gas station, I bought and consumed everything edible, but nothing helped. The mining company called a few days later, asking about the activated equipment and the damaged break room. I told them I'd had some kind of medical episode and couldn't remember details. What I didn't tell them was that I was still hungry, constantly, overwhelmingly hungry, no matter how much I ate. And I could still hear the ore chutes running, that stomach growling sound that seemed to come from inside my own body. I requested a transfer to day shift after that. Working alone in the mine at night wasn't something I could handle anymore, especially with the facility shut down and the shafts supposedly empty. But sometimes, driving past the mine late at night, I still see lights in the processing buildings. Even when I know all the power is shut off, even when I know the mine has been permanently closed, and I still hear my voice on the mine's emergency radio frequency, providing updates on ore production levels that should have ended years ago. The automated foghorn kept sounding, but it was making the exact rhythm of my stomach cramping from hunger. Caretaking the automated lighthouse for the winter was supposed to be simple work. Check the equipment monthly, monitor for storm damage, and keep the access road clear. The lighthouse had been unmanned for decades, but the Coast Guard still needed someone to maintain the property during Maine's brutal coastal winters. I'd been staying in the keeper's house for 2 weeks when the foghorn started acting up. The automated system was supposed to sound during low visibility conditions, triggered by weather sensors and programmed intervals. But it had been sounding constantly for 3 days, despite clear skies and calm seas. What bothered me wasn't just the frequency, it was the rhythm. The horn was sounding in the exact pattern of my stomach cramps, the hunger pangs that had been getting worse each day. Long, low moans followed by shorter blasts, perfectly matching the waves of emptiness that kept hitting me. I'd been eating constantly since arriving at the lighthouse. Not just regular meals, but everything I could find in the house. The previous caretaker had left supplies, and I'd brought my own groceries, but I was consuming it all at an alarming rate. Despite eating massive quantities, I felt like I was starving. The lighthouse beacon was operating normally during the night hours, but around noon on Thursday, I heard my own voice coming from the beacon room at the top of the tower. So hungry, need more food, not enough. The words echoed down the spiral staircase, delivered in my exact tone and cadence. I climbed the 100+ steps to the beacon room and found it empty except for the automated light assembly. But the lighthouse logbook, which should have contained routine maintenance entries, was filled with handwritten notes about hunger. Page after page in my own handwriting, describing the need to feed, to consume, to satisfy an appetite that could never be filled. I had no memory of writing any of it. The foghorn sounded again, that long moan that matched the cramp currently twisting my stomach. I went back to the keeper's house and found the kitchen destroyed. Every cabinet and the refrigerator had been emptied, food containers scattered across the counters and floor. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with desperate efficiency. I had no memory of that feeding session, but my clothes were stained with food, and my stomach felt uncomfortably full. Yet the hollow hunger remained, stronger than ever. From the lighthouse beacon room, my voice was calling. More. Need more. The light requires feeding. That night, during a winter storm that brought heavy fog and high winds, the lighthouse began operating manually. I could see the beacon sweeping across the water in patterns that weren't part of the automated program, and the foghorn was sounding complex sequences instead of the standard warning blasts. I climbed to the beacon room again and found someone operating the equipment, a figure that looked exactly like me, but impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was manually controlling the lighthouse beam, directing it towards specific points on the water with practiced precision. When it saw me, it spoke in my voice. "Finally. Been so hungry up here. Help me feed the light." The figure was consuming something while it worked, dark material that it pulled from containers that hadn't been there before. And as it ate, the lighthouse beam grew brighter, sweeping across the stormy seas with supernatural intensity. "The ships," it said in my voice. "They're coming. Been calling them for days. They always answer when they're hungry enough." I looked out at the water and saw lights approaching through the fog. Multiple vessels moving toward shore despite the dangerous conditions. But as they got closer, I realized they weren't normal ships. They moved wrong, without regard for wind or current. The foghorn was sounding constantly now, those hunger-matching moans that seemed to guide the approaching vessels. And the figure at the lighthouse controls was eating faster, consuming the dark material by the handful. "Almost here," it said. "Been so hungry. The light needs to feed." I ran down the spiral staircase, but the lighthouse seemed taller than before. The steps continuing down far below where the ground level should be. The hunger was overwhelming now, making me dizzy and weak. I found myself in what looked like a ship's hold, dark and filled with the organic material the figure had been consuming. And there were others there, pale, emaciated figures that might once have been sailors, all feeding mechanically on the strange substance. They looked up when I entered, and one of them spoke in my voice. "Welcome aboard. You've been calling us for weeks." I woke up on the lighthouse keeper's house floor the next morning. The Coast Guard knocking on the door. They'd received reports of irregular lighthouse operation during the storm and had come to investigate. I couldn't explain the filled logbook or the destroyed kitchen. I couldn't explain why the automated systems had been manually overridden, or why the lighthouse had been signaling patterns that weren't in any navigation manual. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for weeks afterward, a constant ache that no amount of food could touch. I'd eat until I was sick, then feel empty again within hours. The Coast Guard found evidence that I'd been operating the lighthouse manually during the storm, despite having no training on the older equipment. The logbook showed detailed entries about feeding the light and calling the hungry ones, all in my handwriting. I requested an immediate transfer and left the lighthouse that day. But sometimes, on foggy nights near the coast, I still hear that foghorn sounding in the rhythm of hunger pangs. And I still dream about the approaching ships, filled with pale figures who knew my voice and expected me to guide them safely to shore. The permafrost kept cracking beneath my tent, but it sounded exactly like my stomach breaking a 3-day fast. 10 days into a solo photography expedition on the northern Canadian tundra, I'd grown accustomed to the strange sounds of the Arctic landscape. Wind across endless open ground, the distant call of caribou, the occasional crack of shifting ice. But on day 10, the ground started responding to my hunger. I was camped on what appeared to be stable permafrost, the kind of ground that's been frozen solid for thousands of years. But throughout the night, I heard cracking sounds from directly beneath my tent floor. Deep, resonant cracks that sounded exactly like the stomach growls that had been keeping me awake. The hunger had been getting worse since day 7. Despite eating high-calorie expedition food regularly, I felt constantly empty. Not just tired from the physical demands of tundra travel, but genuinely starving, like I'd been without food for weeks. I'd already consumed most of my supplies for the entire expedition, and I was only halfway through my planned route. Each time my stomach cramped with hunger, the permafrost beneath my tent would crack in response. Not just sound, I could feel the ground shifting, like something was breaking apart in the deep frozen layers below. That morning, my voice started echoing across the tundra. "God, I'm so hungry," came from somewhere in the distance, carried by the wind across miles of empty landscape. My exact words from the night before, delivered in my exact frustrated tone. I called out, "Hello, anyone out there?" The response came back immediately. "Hello, anyone out there?" But with something wrong about the acoustics, like the words were coming from much farther away than they should. Then, from a different direction, I could eat everything I brought and still be empty. Something I'd muttered to myself while rationing my diminishing food supplies. The tundra was completely flat for miles in every direction. No trees or significant landmarks. Nothing that could produce echoes or hide another person. But my voice kept calling back to me, using phrases I'd spoken over the past week. Around noon, I noticed my food cache was sinking. I'd secured my extra supplies in a weather-resistant container, anchored to the permafrost with ice screws. But the container was slowly disappearing into the ground, like the frozen earth was swallowing it. I tried to pull it free, but the permafrost had cracked around it in a perfect circle, creating a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. My food supplies were already 10 feet down and sinking deeper. The cracking sounds were constant now, matching every hunger pang that hit me, and the cracks were forming patterns, straight lines radiating out from my tent in all directions, like something beneath the permafrost was trying to surface. That evening, while setting up camp in a new location, I found claw marks in the frozen ground, massive gouges in permafrost that should have been hard as concrete. The scratches ran in parallel lines, like something with enormous talons had raked across the surface. But permafrost doesn't scratch. It's frozen earth and rock, solid as stone. The marks were fresh, with ice crystals still forming in the gouges. From across the tundra, my voice was calling, "Still hungry. So hungry, never enough." I'd never said those exact phrases. I pitched my tent and tried to eat dinner, but the food seemed to disappear as soon as I swallowed it. I could taste it, feel it going down, but my stomach remained empty, like I was eating phantom food that couldn't satisfy real hunger. The permafrost cracking was so loud now, it sounded like gunshots. Deep, resonant cracks that seemed to come from miles underground, and each crack was followed by my voice, echoing across the landscape with complaints about hunger. Around midnight, I felt my tent moving. Not wind, actual movement, like the ground beneath me was shifting. I looked outside and saw that my entire campsite was sliding across the tundra, the permafrost carrying everything in a straight line towards some distant point. The landscape around me was unchanged, but my GPS showed impossible readings. According to the device, I was traveling at highway speeds across terrain where movement should be measured in feet per hour. In the morning, I woke up in a location I'd never seen before. My tent was set up in the center of a perfect circle of cracked permafrost, the frozen ground radiating out in geometric patterns. And standing at the edge of the circle was a figure that looked exactly like me. Same height, same expedition gear, same methodical movements I used when breaking camp, but impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. When it saw me watching, It waved the same casual greeting I used when acknowledging other travelers. Then it spoke in my voice. Finally awake. Been so hungry waiting for you. The figure was consuming something while it talked. Chunks of what looked like frozen permafrost, eating the dark earth mechanically. And as it ate, the cracks in the ground spread outward, creating new patterns of broken, frozen earth. The ground is full of old hungers, it said in my voice. Thousands of years of things that died hungry. They're all still down there, waiting. I started backing toward my GPS beacon, but the figure moved to intercept me. It walked exactly like me, but too smoothly. Like it didn't need to worry about balance on the uneven ground. Don't leave yet, it said. The feeding hasn't started. Been calling you for days. The permafrost around my feet began cracking, creating a shaft that descended into darkness. And from deep underground, I could hear sounds like an enormous stomach growling. I activated my emergency beacon and ran across the tundra, the ground cracking beneath every step. Behind me, I could hear the figure calling in my voice. Come back. The earth is hungry. Help us feed. The rescue helicopter found me 12 hours later, wandering in circles on stable permafrost 50 miles from where my last GPS position had been logged. I was dehydrated and hypothermic, but alive. I couldn't explain the impossible travel distance or the cracked permafrost patterns that the pilot photographed from the air. I couldn't explain why my emergency beacon had been activated in a location I'd never been to. What I could explain was the hunger. It stayed with me for weeks after the rescue, a constant ache that no amount of food could touch. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours. The expedition photos I'd taken showed something that still bothers me. In images from the final days, the landscape looks normal during daylight hours, but the time-lapse sequences show the ground moving at night, shifting and cracking in patterns that look almost like writing. Like something beneath the permafrost was trying to communicate through the frozen earth itself. I never returned to the Arctic for solo expeditions, and I never camped on permafrost again during any season. Some kinds of ground aren't stable enough to trust, especially when you can't be sure what's been frozen underneath for thousands of years. The pipeline pressure alarms kept triggering, but they were singing in the exact rhythm of my hunger pangs. Night shift at the Dalton Highway pipeline. Monitoring station meant 12 hours alone with the computer systems that tracked oil flow from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. Most nights were routine. Monitor pressure readings, log flow rates, and respond to any system anomalies across 800 miles of pipeline. This particular Wednesday started wrong from the moment I clocked in. The pressure alarm system was activating every few minutes, but not for the usual reasons. Instead of sharp warning tones, the alarms were producing low musical notes that perfectly matched the rhythm of the hunger pangs I'd been feeling all evening. I'd eaten a full dinner before my shift, but sitting at the monitoring station, I felt genuinely starving. Not just tired from the drive up the Dalton Highway, but empty in a way that made my hands shake and my vision blur. The alarm tones were getting more complex, creating harmonies that rose and fell with each wave of hunger that hit me. When my stomach cramped, the alarms would crescendo. When the pain faded, the tones would drop to a whisper. I checked the system diagnostics. All pressure readings were normal, flow rates within acceptable parameters, no equipment malfunctions detected, but the alarms kept singing. and they were definitely responding to my physical condition. Around 10 p.m., the pipeline communication system activated. Station 47 to control, in my own voice. But I was sitting at the monitoring station, not using the radio. The transmission continued. So hungry up here, operations require more feeding. I'd never made that transmission, had never used those words. I radioed the main control center in Fairbanks. This is Station 47. Did you receive any communications from this location in the past hour? Static. Then my own voice came back. This is Station 47. Did you receive any communications from this location in the past hour? But I could hear the pressure alarm singing in the background of the transmission. I walked through the station to check for equipment malfunctions and found the break room destroyed. Every refrigerator and cabinet had been opened and emptied. Food containers scattered across tables and floor. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with systematic efficiency. But what made my radio shake in my hand was the methodical nature of it. Whoever had done this had opened every container carefully, consumed the contents, then stacked the empties in neat piles, like someone had been very organized about their feeding. The pressure alarms were constant now, a complex symphony that seemed to respond to every sensation in my body. When I felt dizzy from hunger, they would produce discordant notes. When I tried to eat something, they would harmonize. I went outside to check the pipeline infrastructure and found scratches on the main valve housing. Deep gouges in the steel, like something with massive claws had tried to tear into the pipeline itself. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the protective coating. But what stopped me cold were the pipeline readings on my monitoring station. The computer showed impossible flow patterns, oil moving backward through sections of pipe, pressure readings that fluctuated in rhythm with the alarms, flow rates that spelled out words when I converted them to text. Hungry, F-E-E-D, more. The pipeline communication system was broadcasting continuously now, my voice providing updates on operations. But the words weren't about oil flow. They were about hunger, about feeding, about never having enough to satisfy the operation. Around midnight, I found myself operating pipeline controls I'd never been trained on. Advanced systems that were supposed to be controlled remotely from Fairbanks, but I was running them manually with practiced efficiency, adjusting flow rates, rerouting sections, even temporarily shutting down segments for what my voice announced as feeding procedures. I had no memory of starting this work, no recollection of learning these complex procedures, but my hands moved across the controls like I'd been doing this for years. The hunger was overwhelming now. I opened every emergency food supply in the station and consumed everything I could find. MRES, energy bars, even coffee creamer and sugar packets. But no matter how much I ate, the hollow feeling got worse. The pressure alarms were shrieking now, a cacophony that matched my panic-elevated heart rate, and through the station windows, I could see a figure walking along the pipeline. Tall and impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was checking valve stations and monitoring points with methodical precision, exactly like I did during routine inspections, but it moved too smoothly across the rough terrain. When it reached my station, it looked directly at me through the window. In my own voice it said, "Finally, been so hungry out here. Help me feed the line." The figure was consuming something while it talked, dark material that it pulled from containers attached to the pipeline. And as it ate, the pipeline readings showed massive pressure increases, like something was being forced through the system at impossible rates. "The oil isn't enough," it said in my voice. The line needs organic material. Been trying to tell control for hours. I tried to radio Fairbanks for emergency backup, but my own voice was jamming all frequencies, providing constant updates on feeding operations and organic supplementation procedures. The figure entered the station and began operating the controls with me, our movements perfectly synchronized. It adjusted settings while I monitored readings, like we were a practice team managing some kind of feeding system. But the figure was eating constantly, consuming the dark material by the handful, and as it fed, the pipeline alarm sang louder, creating harmonies that made the entire station vibrate. I triggered the emergency shutdown sequence and ran for my truck, but the hunger was so intense I could barely drive. I stopped at every building along the Dalton Highway, looking for food, but nothing helped. The pipeline company called the next morning, asking about the unauthorized shutdown and the strange flow patterns logged during my shift. I told them I'd had some kind of medical episode and couldn't remember details. What I didn't tell them was that I was still hungry. Constantly, overwhelmingly hungry, no matter how much I ate. And I could still hear the pressure alarm singing, that complex harmony that seemed to come from inside my own body. I requested immediate reassignment to day shift operations in Fairbanks. Working alone at the remote monitoring stations wasn't something I could handle anymore, but sometimes, driving the Dalton Highway late at night, I still see lights at the pipeline stations. Even when I know they're supposed to be running on automated systems, even when no operator is scheduled. And I still hear my voice on the pipeline emergency frequencies, providing updates on feeding operations that aren't part of any legitimate maintenance procedure. The well pump kept cycling on and off in perfect rhythm with my hunger pangs, but I lived alone and wasn't using any water. I'd rented the isolated ranch house in northern Wyoming for a month-long writing retreat, choosing February because the rates were low and I needed complete isolation to finish my novel. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the house came with its own well, propane heat, and everything I needed for a solo winter residency. The well pump situation started on my 4th day there. I was working at the kitchen table when I noticed the pump cycling on more frequently than it should. The system was supposed to activate when water pressure dropped, but I hadn't been using much water, just normal daily amounts for cooking and washing. But the pump was running every few minutes, always in the exact rhythm of the hunger pangs that had been bothering me since I'd arrived. When my stomach cramped with emptiness, the pump would kick on. When the pain faded, the pump would shut off. I'd been hungrier than usual since arriving at the ranch. Despite eating large meals, I felt constantly hollow. Real hunger, the kind that makes your hands shake and your vision blur. I'd already gone through most of the groceries I'd brought for the week. The pump rhythm was getting more precise, matching not just the timing of my hunger pangs, but their intensity. Light stomach discomfort would trigger short pump cycles. Intense hunger would cause the pump to run for minutes at a time. That evening, I heard my own voice coming from the well house. So hungry, echoing from the small building that housed the pump equipment. My exact words from earlier that day, delivered in my exact frustrated tone. I walked outside with a flashlight and found the well house door standing open. I definitely locked it when I checked the system during my initial walk around, but now it hung wide and I could hear activity inside. From the basement of the ranch house, my voice again. Need more food, still empty. Things I'd muttered to myself while making dinner. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" The well pump activated immediately, and my own voice echoed from both the well house and the basement. Hello? Someone there? But was something wrong about the acoustics, like the words were coming from deep underground. I went back inside and found the kitchen ransacked. Every cabinet and the refrigerator had been opened and emptied. Food containers scattered across counters and floor. It looked like someone had gone through everything edible with desperate efficiency. I had no memory of that feeding session, but my clothes were stained with food and my stomach felt uncomfortably full. Yet the hollow hunger remained, stronger than ever. The well pump was running constantly now, that rhythmic cycling that perfectly matched my hunger patterns. I tried shutting off the electrical breaker, but the pump kept running, like it was drawing power from some other source. From the basement, eating sounds, wet chewing, like someone working through tough food. The sounds were accompanied by my voice providing commentary, still hungry, and more, and never enough. I'd never said those exact phrases. I went down to the basement and found the water pressure tank surrounded by scratches, deep gouges in the metal housing, like something with massive claws had tried to get at the water system. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the painted surface. But what made me start packing was the water itself. I turned on the kitchen faucet and dark, sediment-filled water flowed out. Not rust or minerals, something organic that moved in the water like it was alive. And it smelled wrong, like meat left in a warm place for too long. The well pump was shrieking now, running at maximum pressure. I could hear it drawing something up from deep underground, but it wasn't just water anymore. The pipes throughout the house were making sounds like digestion, wet gurgles and swallows. From the well house, my voice was calling. Help me pump it up, so much down there, been hungry for so long. I looked outside and saw a figure operating the well manually, tall and impossibly thin, like someone who hadn't eaten in months. It was working the old hand pump that had been disconnected years ago, drawing material up from the well with practiced efficiency. When it saw me watching, it spoke in my voice. Finally, been so hungry down here. Help me feed from the deep water. The figure was consuming what it pumped. Dark, organic material that flowed from the well like liquid, but moved like something alive. And as it drank, the automatic pump system responded, working harder to bring up more material. The aquifer, it said in my voice, full of old hungers, everything that died thirsty and hungry. They all sink down to the water table eventually. The well was overflowing now, dark material spilling across the ranch yard, and everywhere it touched the ground, I could hear sounds like distant stomach growling, like the earth itself was hungry. I threw my belongings into my car and drove back to Cheyenne without stopping. The hunger so intense I had to pull over at every gas station to buy and consume everything edible I could find. The ranch management company called a few days later, asking about the well contamination and the damaged pressure system. I told them I'd had some kind of medical episode and couldn't remember details. What I didn't tell them was that I was still thirsty, constantly, overwhelmingly thirsty, no matter how much I drank, and the water never tasted right. There was always that dark, organic taste that reminded me of the ranch well. The hunger didn't fade for weeks either. I'd eat massive meals and feel empty again within hours, like the food was disappearing into some deep internal well that could never be filled. I never finished the novel I went there to write. Every time I tried to work on it, I'd hear that well pump cycling and remember the taste of the contaminated water. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I still hear pumping sounds. Even though I live in a city with municipal water, even though there's no well within miles, the sounds come from inside the walls, rhythmic and purposeful, like something is still trying to pump dark material up from deep underground. Thanks for letting these stories keep you company. If they're helping you unwind, hit subscribe for new stories to listen to every night. Quick pause from the stories. Only about 5% of regular listeners are actually subscribed. If you listen to these often, hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds and ensures you never miss a collection. Plus, it helps the algorithm show these to other people who need calm horror for sleep. Thank you, and let's get back to the video. The next 6 stories dive deeper into winter encounters. If you're finding these helpful for sleep, the full Wendigo playlist has hours more calm chills. Sweet dreams.